Rugby values are just propaganda for the game of rugby at this point. Straight up, it's just a way for the game to pat itself on the back and say, aren't we good at being bloody civil and being better than all those other sports? Because we shake hands after games and clap and have a cold beverage of choice after the game. That's community. I'm being slightly flippant, but it can get a bit grating when you see a picture of players consoling each other after a loss and all the captions saying, that's what rugby's about. Proper rugby values there. There's no sport like it. It's a weird, snobbish thing that we as a rugby collective sometimes do, comparing ourselves to other popular sports, especially football, and saying that could never happen in our game, and just saying rugby values under any social media post at the moment has almost become a meme in of itself. Now, I do think the ideals of the sort of rugby principles, for want of a better term, are good, and if they are upheld, send a great message to the young kids coming up playing the game, like respecting the ref, shaking your opponent's hand after the game, and all that cordial, respectful stuff. It's all cool. But I guess the problem I have with it, and what makes it seem like it's a bit empty, is because the reality of competitive sport can never really keep up with those ideals. Well, it can, but it's incredibly difficult and you have to work at it. Once winning and losing start to matter, things get messy, people cheat, tempers flare, refs make mistakes. Sport's very nature of supposed cruel objectivity, where the best should win because they are better, doesn't really jive with the hippie good vibes that your sort of junior rugby education would lead you to believe. As the older you get, the more these principles fade, at least in my experience anyway. It's easy to be a nice guy when the games don't really matter, and it's just the taking part and having a good time that's of consequence. But once a kid's hopes of getting into an academy depend on how good his team is, and all the way up to his chances of having a professional career, those sort of rugby values are probably the furthest thing from his or her brain. Things get heated, and I haven't even talked about the parent side of this whole conundrum. It's just a nightmare. I've been on the pitch for full-on brawls between teams, a fan fighting one of the players, had friends be racially or religiously abused, and that's just the stuff I can remember off the top of my head. All at least at semi-pro levels of the game, so if you're thinking it was just like some random club games where these things happen, nah. There are pricks in every sport, and to act like rugby's environment filters these people out of our system is, just to put it nicely, incorrect. I get it's a good look and probably a very different experience for casual fans or newcomers to the game, and they probably see people like Nigel Owens putting players in their place on the odd viral clip and they're like, yeah, that's rugby. And I guess maybe there's a bit of a divide of opinions on rugby's perception of itself and its perception to normal people, as well as jaded hardcores like myself, who all see the game in different ways. Because as a jaded hardcore, the sort of tribal blind loyalty to any narrative the general rugby populace comes up with to prop ourselves up can wear a little thin on me, especially when there's still so much going on in the game that people just don't want to address. In fact, I've got a list. First up, the All Blacks' history of sweeping their players' issues with domestic abuse under the rug, without paying it any real attention. Yeah, I'm mentioning it. I already have shot my chances of working with Premiership Rugby in the foot, so I might as well go all in. Speaking of, there's, the Exeter issue with their branding, so yeah. Actually, before I go any further, I should delve deeper into the All Blacks point. I realise it's very, very complicated when domestic abuse is involved. There are multiple different factors with incidents like this. For example, are the two people involved still together? Is this a regular occurrence? How the incident occurred? And 100 other things that are all equally uncomfortable to deal with. And as the general public, I don't know if we will ever get the full story on any instance like this, or even that we should. It's a very difficult and complex human issue all around the world, and if I'm honest, I don't know how to deal with it, because it's such a sensitive issue, and rightly so. But with that sensitivity there comes weird grey areas. If people are involved in something like this and had to pay a fine but they weren't actually convicted, are they entitled to keep doing their job? But you could argue that both the punishment seems minimal for what happened, as well as the fact that their job is in the public eye. And if I were a victim of something similar, I'd feel a way about seeing someone who allegedly has done those things on my television being celebrated and praised. When Julian Surveyor had his issues in 2013, he was required to complete an anger management course and publicly apologise, which weirdly, despite it being so long ago and in the grand scheme of things relatively simple, it has honestly been I'm going to say, most tastefully handled, because I can't think of a better way to put it. Not in terms of the actions, just the way that they were addressed. Oh, and if you believe that the punishment wasn't severe enough and it just seems like another time someone of influence has gotten off lightly, I ain't gonna argue with you, because you definitely have more than a fair point. But even with all of those caveats, somehow we seem to have gone backwards in terms of accountability from that point. Now it just seems like the All Blacks employ the Queen's policy of don't apologise and don't explain, which is an effective way to get people to move on and forget about things, but that doesn't make it right. I know it's hard to provide a solution with this, and I don't know if I'm being too defeatist and accepting of the situation, but I feel like the bare minimum expected of players who have these kind of issues should be a public acknowledging of the situation, followed by some sort of work with an organisation that helps people deal with these kinds of situations. Not because I'm hungry to see these people pay for what they've done or squirm or whatever, but because pro rugby players, especially international players, are, whether they want to be or even should be, are role models to young people, and I believe that they need to see that there are consequences to these actions and that they must be at the bare minimum addressed, and not what currently happens where they're ignored or just swept away. Even now saying all this, I don't know if what I said is enough, and just for context on my feelings on this, I've had experience as a victim of this thing as well as being around it happening to others. So if you feel what I've said is laying off people too lightly, I understand. It's rough. But yeah, no dickheads. Alright, this downer train keeps rolling, so let's talk about the abuse of players and officials online, shall we? Now, I'm going to keep my views on this as simple as possible. I reckon as a rule, don't at the player you're chatting about if it's a negative sense. Look, we've all been there where a player's on-field decision has left us feeling a level of confusion, anger and sadness that cannot be explained in words. But don't at them. Even posting about it is... I guess it's okay. If you absolutely must get it off your chest and put it out for the world to see, just be a bit more indirect about it so the player can't find it. Like when I see Arsenal fans tweeting about Xhaka by just referring to him as number 34, who I've just seen as I'm recording this has gotten sent off against Man City, which is just the best. Anyway, back on track. Every sport has a problem with online abuse, and rugby is no different, especially when it gets to the international stage. And to be honest, the only solution I can think of is out of the rugby community's control, where there's a lack of anonymity on the internet, which probably isn't ever going to happen. I do believe in the right to privacy, but I think that should be limited to being an observer. To actively interact with people should be a right reserved for people who are willing to put their face and their name to their opinions. But maybe that opens a whole new can of worms, so yeah. It's like I said, once the game matters, people show a different side of themselves. And speaking of, let's talk about the lack of honourable play in the professional game these days. So, gamesmanship and cheating has always been a massive part of rugby. Seeing what the ref will let you get away with has been symbiotic with the game since its beginning, because, to be honest, in the past, a lot of the time even players didn't know what was going on and what was allowed. Or they would at least feign ignorance. I grew up on Wasps in the 2000s, and Delalio would be doing the most blatant crap I've ever seen in my life, looking in the ref's eyes as he's doing it, asking if he's okay. And sometimes they'd just be like, yeah, why not? But now in the modern pro game, it's more evolved into seeing what you can get away with other players rather than the ref. The niggle and the petty squabbling is very in vogue, because blatantly cheating now results in yellow cards and, if it's bad, maybe even a red. Now it just feels like there's a million little things happening at once, and the ref can't possibly see them all. And before you'd have like a massive brawl and punches would be thrown and people would get a yellow or a red depending on the ref's judgment at the time. And then the game would be a bit niggly, but it'd be rare for another all-out brawl to like start again, basically. Now it's all grabbing and pushing where players have to stand up for themselves and push back and protect their teammates. But because nothing will happen, and because no one wants to get cited, fined or banned, it's just a load of nothing and complaining to the ref. But also because nothing actually happened and it will just result in a penalty to one of the teams afterwards, there's nothing to stop it happening again. And tense games that mean a lot can tend to get bogged down by this weird fighty, not fighting, usually caused by one team doing something, like I mentioned before, it's not illegal or it's borderline, but it's definitely not honourable. So yeah, rugby is a bit of a mess a lot of the time, and rugby values will be dropped at the first sign of trouble. But weirdly, the one place I actually believe we uphold these values is within our own circles, like our own rugby clubs, atmospheres at training or at the club bar. One of the great things that rugby has going for it is it's all built on rugby clubs and a sense of community within those clubs. I guess when it's your own club, you're a lot less likely to cause a commotion, as it very rarely benefits you long term. So I guess we have a weird insular loyalty to principles when it directly benefits us. But I guess the conclusion of this video and the point of it is me wanting to draw attention to certain issues in our game and have a little rant about it. But the main point is that we are not above issues in our game, and we shouldn't act like we are. If we are going to champion these principles about our game, then we need to start living up to them in every sense, by at least not disregarding culture in our branding or not letting our players get away with certain things. We need to keep making noise, and that should be the point of rugby values, not letting crap slide in our community. If we are truly better than other sports, we have to actually walk the walk rather than being all talk. People making big deals about issues in the game is how I know about something that I haven't experienced myself. It works. And maybe we can redefine this term as something that we can hold each other accountable for. I get that everyone's tired and there's always seemingly another new issue that's wrong. But if we actually want to be what we say we are, we have to keep fighting and continue to evolve. Signed NGJ.